Hello, I'm Chris Sellers, professor of history at Stony Brook University. I spent the last year, 2021, as the research fellow at the Institute of Historical Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm here to report on how that went. I had a productive and enjoyable year, I'm happy to say, though not exactly in the ways that I anticipated. Let me begin by thanking those who have enabled and hosted this year, Courtney and Miriam for their admirable shepherding through all those administrative hurdles, Erica and Megan, and also my fellow Melissa for their intellectual leadership and camaraderie. And all of this helped make this, what was really an unusual year, a genuine success, at least from my end. The pandemic did keep me out of Austin. I only had internet connections to the Institute's vibrant scholarly community. It prevented my planned visits to my case study sites, libraries, and archives. But at least this group of fellows, while we couldn't meet for lunch or coffee, we did meet virtually on a regular basis. And through these discussions, as well as the spirited scholarly dialogue at Institute events, enjoyed that. Of course, through the time I had for extensive reading and internet accessible research, at least, I made considerable progress thinking through precisely what I want this book to do and to say. I honed a more innovative and durable structure for my book, I think, while drafting what I believe, or maybe I'm just hoping here, will prove the book's most challenging parts. My book project, entitled Gathering Clouds, delves into the environmental history of the oil industry and its associated cities or petropolises in Texas and in Mexico. And I can refer you to some of my other events that I've done here and at IHS for more information on the substance of the research. This project began about a decade ago when I was focused on the industry's toxic pollutants. But in the last few years, I've sought to extend the scope to greenhouse emissions, both from the industry itself and from the consumers of the oil industry's products. Helping me, spur me in this direction are the studies that emerged really in the mid-2010s, illuminating just how much the oil industry has contributed to a global scale of climate change. Just 90 carbon majors, the biggest of the oil companies, are responsible for about 63% of this ramp up in atmospheric carbon accumulation over the last 2 centuries. A really incredible number. A major step enabled by my fellowship was to flesh out how both these countries' dealings with toxic pollutants actually grounded their subsequent approach to carbon emissions. Already having gathered and written up much of the toxic pollutant history here, I undertook in the course of the fellowship a deep dive into primary sources in the history of climate science and governmental action from the 1970s, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to each nation's evolving carbon policies, all this with an eye out for what was being said and done about oil. For my workshop presentation in November 2020, I wrote up what I had found. I drafted accounts of those national and international discussions that will then, and will now thread through my book's final 3 chapters. This round of research and writing also helped me resolve what's been the thorniest challenge of writing this book, balancing between the scales that are relevant. Globally minded historians of industry-related hazards have provided 2 very different models for resolving this dilemma. Either they set the histories of locales in 2 nations alongside one another, as in books by Kate Brown and Bathsheba DeMuth, who was one of our speakers this year, or they incline their narratives upward, as with the economic and colonial transnational threads that take up much of Gabriela Hecht's book on the French African nuclear industry. My early vision for Gathering Clouds had been more in line with the Brown-DeMuth approach, comparative local and regional account of the industry and its toxic pollutants, pollution in my 2 petropolises. But in thinking through how to encompass the climatory aspects of my metropolises, courtesy of this fellowship, I realized that this book also needed to switch up to higher scales, where the industry's impacts accrue and where most grappling with the current climate crisis has actually happened. I've now settled upon a unique multi-scalar balance for my book, sketched out in my workshop paper for the IHS's climate conference in April 2021. Much of it still unfolds at this human scale of local and regional experience within my metropolises. That remains the backbone. But the narrative also leaps upward to ongoing carbon accumulation in the world's atmosphere, as well as to national and global human arenas where knowledge and policies for carbon emissions come to be brokered. Especially through the book's latter half, more of the action and analysis will center on Washington, D.C., Mexico City, also on the international bodies like IPCC and the climate talks between world leaders from Rio to Paris. One final accomplishment of my year at the IHS has been to figure out how to intervene or interweave the more indirect and recent impacts of the oil industry through climate change, like the intensifying rainstorms and hurricanes now afflicting my metropolises, with the more direct industrial impacts experienced over the much longer haul, such as from toxic pollution. From the start, my book now situates metropolitan contentions with these recognizably or easily recognizable industrial hazards, alongside those with dangers then conceived as natural, such as from flooding and high winds. For this and subsequent periods, all the way up into the early 20th century, my analysis then centers on how such lines were negotiated and drawn to distinguish which environmental dangers were attributable to local industry versus which were thought to be caused by more natural or divine influences, such as acts of God. I sketched out this trajectory for my book in the presentation I did for the Oil and Water panel in April 2021. Researching and writing up several such sections has revealed other interesting themes. For instance, the parallel ramping up of governmental efforts to foretell as well as to alleviate the impacts of both industrial and natural dangers over the mid-20th century. For the more recent period, my write-up still awaits return visits to my metropolises when that becomes possible. I need to interview residents about any dawning realizations they may have had about how oil's production and usage might be worsening their local storms and floods. Overall, my fellowship has enabled a thorough reorientation of the book around the oil industry's historical relationship with climate change. And I've written up as much as half of what I aim to say about that. I've also arrived at some greater clarity about the central paradox around which this year's climate theme has been organized: precedents for the unprecedented. Yes, for humankind, the current climate crisis is in important ways unprecedented, but it is not so productive and could even be dangerous to seek wholly unprecedented solutions. To realistically address and handle the challenges of climate change, we need to look at our own history and look hard. In the historical record lies much guidance and wisdom, successes as well as failures, which humankind has experienced in dealing with at least comparable dilemmas. And that's why, contrary to what so many commentators assume, history and historians have an absolutely vital role to play in confronting the climate crisis. Finally, I need to add that the accomplishments of my year at the IHS also extend beyond my own book project. Our climate-interested cohort of fellows and UT faculty have also forged some very promising plans, I think, for collaborating in the months and years ahead, from short pieces such as op-eds to a cross-institutional project on the teaching of infrastructure history. I look forward to this joint work ahead, also to actually visiting Austin sometime, hopefully in the next year. It will be great to finally meet you all in person, all these colleagues I've only seen through my computer screen and emails, whom I now count as friends. Thanks so much for this opportunity.